All right, so now we're going to get into basically the meat of what today's all about, which is building a decent, good mix. We'll call this elements of a good mix, but there are some general guidelines to this. The first is that you want to hear every instrument very clearly. Whenever you have a bunch of stuff going on, you want to be able to say, okay, can I hear the keyboards? Yes. Can I hear the bass? Yes. Can I hear the guitar? Yes. Can I hear each one of them well enough to know that that is what it is? Or do you have to like really strain to, like, I can't really tell if that's the guitar or not. And you crank it up, it's like, well, that's the guitar, but if I bring it back in volume with everything, I don't really know it's a guitar. So you want to make sure that you're using EQ effectively so you know, hey, this is a guitar, or hey, this is a piano. Next thing is that distortion is typically bad, unless you're talking about electric guitar. Electric guitar distortion is great, as long as they're intending it to be distorted. If they are not intending it to be distorted, then it's very bad. But typically distortion on anything is bad. Usually means you have too much gain on something, or your speakers are pushing too hard and they just can't handle the amount of signal you're sending to them. Which is typically where 90 decibels for us is kind of like our peak cutoff. Anything at 90 decibels or more, we start to get really bad noises in this room. Generally, you never want to clip a channel because that causes distortion. But anytime you see a little clip light come on, you want to see what that's all about, okay? And lastly, louder is not always better. If you're in a situation where everything sounds really good, but if you can't hear something and you want to hear it, turning it up is not necessarily the answer. Maybe you need to turn other things down a little bit. Not talking about a whole lot, but just enough so you can hear what you need to hear. So that's just a general rule of thumb. Here, if I'm at 85 decibels according to my meter, I can usually turn something up. If I'm louder than 85 decibels, at that point I'm looking to turn things down if I can't hear something.
So if I wanted to hear whatever Justin is playing, I turn everything else down.
Just turn it off.
Okay.
You just want your electric guitar, and then you'll see a bunch of people on stage doing a bunch of stuff, and that's all you need.
If I just want to hear what Justin is doing.
Yeah. So
We all know it's all about that.
you're not the only one that gets in trouble when he can't be heard.
What did you say?
He gets in trouble when, yeah. All right.
That was his solo. Why didn't you turn
So the
I did say though.
the sound envelope. I was kind of torn whether or not to talk about this or not, but I think it helps understand some things, especially when it comes to effects. Every source of sound will have a sound envelope. That is an attack, a decay, a sustain, and a release. Every once in a while you see something that's called a hold, which is usually where the attack comes in before the decay. But usually, especially when you're talking about anything with a nice big pop to it, like a drum, you'll have the attack of the stick hitting the drum. Then you're gonna have a really sharp decay, but then you're gonna have this sustain effect. So like on a tom, you're gonna have like this little ring. It's gonna kind of resonate a little bit, and then it's gonna release back to zero. So understanding where these are in each of the in terms of effects will help you set compressors correctly, will help you set your gates correctly, and because each of these 4 words here relates to an option for those effects. Okay? So when you're building a mix, the very first thing you want to do is get proper gain structure. So what that means is that you want to basically have all your signals coming in from all your channels at decent gain volumes, which on here you'd have to use a solo switch for an analog board, and you'd use this meter here. You basically want to make sure they're all kind of relatively in the same area. From there, usually around 0 on an analog board. For a digital board, it's usually about -18, -15. on the meter. That's where you're shooting for. Again, that's not necessarily hard, fast rule, but that's typically where you're going to end up. And then you use your faders to adjust your volume after that once you get through everything else. That is the most common way of doing things. There is a secondary way of doing it, which is not as common. I used to follow the secondary one exclusively, but I've wisened up because it doesn't really work well when you have band mixes, modern mixes on stage. The other option is for setting your gain structure, you set your fader to 0, which is unity, and then you adjust your gain around that to the volume you want in your room. There's neither way is wrong. I'm going to explain why, if you're using one soundboard, this is not the preferred way. If you're using one soundboard, all of your modern mixes, all of your mixes to your video recording, anything else that you're sending a signal to is affected by gain. So if you have your fader at 0 and you have your gain way off on that channel, that affects what other people hear using other mixes. It may sound great in your PA system, but may alter what the band hears in their ears. It may alter what the video recorder hears. So it's better to just have a uniform gain across the board when you're using one mixer, and then adjust your faders to your room. If you have the luxury of having 2 mixers, unity is the best way to go because your second mixer will handle everything else. But 99% of the time in a church, you're going to have one mixer, one console. So again, either way is okay. Better gain ends up being better for the band, and they'll thank you for it later. So again, if you mix it to unity, we have more control over volume changes because the ratio from the fader. So if you're at 0, you can make a small change, it's a small change. If you're at -40, you make a small change, it's a big change. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to have so much gain that your fader's all the way down here, close to the bottom, where if you need to make a change, it's very hard. You want to have enough give so you have the best of both worlds. Okay? Next thing you're going to run to is EQ. So most people, when they think of EQ, if they're not dealing with sound periodically, they're like, okay, well, if I'm in a car, I want to crank the bass, and I want to have a little bit more of the high end of it. And that's great, except in a sound system, that's the wrong way of thinking about it. What you want to do is you want to get rid of everything you don't want to hear and only boost if you need to. So this is called the seek and destroy method. So whenever you're listening to something that doesn't sound right, you crank your gain where you, on your EQ knob, where, like for your mid frequency, you just crank it up a little bit. You use your frequency knob to find what it is that sounds really bad, and then you turn your EQ off. Not completely, but like, turn it down below 0. That is the best way of using EQ in a sound system. Can you use EQ the other way and you want to just crank up the bass a little bit? You can, but just keep in mind that the gain knob that you're messing with is actually affecting your gain structure. Okay? So if you have a good gain structure and you're happy with it, cut what you don't need, boost only if you have to. That way you're always going to be kind of pretty solid. Okay? So, this right here, I showed at the workshop. It's kind of hard to see on this screen, but don't worry about this. This is kind of like a bad slide anyway. Mostly I just wanted you to see this because if you look at it, if you notice, most things all fall right in that mid-range category, right? You'll have a few things that are kind of on the low end, a few things that are kind of on the high end, but almost everything is right in the middle of both charts. So that's where we need to do a lot of mid-range cutting when you have a full band playing. This next one is kind of terms that you'll hear people say. So on a standard piano, from It's an 88 key piano, but this one also has an octave below and 2 octaves up. But all these noises here is where you'll hear somebody say, hey, it sounds a little tinny. Well, that's up in the 1 to 2K range of the mids. And generally speaking, when people say those words, that's because that's what it sounds like. Anything that sounds like a crunch is typically around the 3K, 4K range. So this is kind of like helping you out. Like if someone says, hey, it sounds a little muddy in here. Well, now you know an approximate idea of where you can go and adjust EQ for that. This is not my actual EQ drum, but this is an example of what an EQ drum might look like. If you notice, we have a big, huge cut in it, right in the lower mids. That's kind of typical for a kick drum because it's very boxy, very tubby in sound with a microphone. You have to understand that the microphone is sitting right up next to that instrument. So anything that it hears is going to be amplified a whole lot more than what you would hear standing 10 feet back from it. So that's where we use a lot of EQ to do certain things. But as always, general rule of EQ, you need to get it right at the source. So if it doesn't sound good at the source, it's not going to sound a whole lot better when you put a whole lot of EQ into it. Can you make it sound pretty good? Sometimes. But sometimes, no matter what you do, it's going to sound bad. So every once in a while, you'll see me during a practice come up and I'll adjust where a microphone is on a drum, or I'll adjust where the microphone is on the guitar. Typically, you can't really change the way a vocalist sounds other than just point the microphone in a different spot. But adjusting where the microphone is on various instruments, you can change the way the sound has to do.
Which vocalist are you talking about?
I'm talking about a particular vocalist who's not in this room right now.
Oh, okay. I was just curious.
The vocalist who sings in this room is usually one of my better ones.
Usually one of your better ones.
Usually.
That might be one of the nicest things you've ever said.
Absolutely. Justin?
Anyways, so the point of the matter is you can only do so much with EQ. If you get it sounding right at the source and if you mic it right, you actually don't have to do that much EQ to make it sound right. Okay? Garbage in, garbage out. All right, so. Questions so far? Anything? Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is gates. I already kind of explained what this was earlier, but basically you have to get the volume up to a certain threshold before the signal will get processed by the rest of the soundboard. You use that to filter out unwanted noise. So on a drum kit, for example, you have a lot of mics, but you don't want the mics coming through the system all the time. So we use a lot of gates, especially on like kick drums and maybe a snare. Otherwise, you'll get a lot of like cymbals and everything else coming through, and it's not going to sound very good in a PA system. So that's what a gate is used for. So the threshold is how much volume you have to have, right? The attack is how quickly do we let that sound get through to the system. So there's actually, you can actually open it up right away, or you can make it slow, so that way when you hit it, it'll gradually turn itself on. There's different reasons why you would want to mess with that. 99% of the time, you're going to want to open as fast as possible, so attack of 0. These are all measured in milliseconds, and there's numbers here on the board that'll tell you what you're doing too. A release is how fast does that gate close off. So if you have a kick drum with a really slow release, you're going to hear the kick, and then you're going to hear everything else for another couple seconds while that volume turns itself back off. So if you make it too fast, you're not going to get the full sound of the kick drum, but if you make it too long, you're going to hear a bunch of other stuff you don't want to hear. Okay, that's basically the way gates work with attacks and releases. So, compression is the next thing that you'll encounter on the soundboard. Compression is used to control spikes in volume. I say loud volume here, but it's basically a spike in volume. Typically what you'll want things to be uncompressed unless you want to control how loud it gets, how fast it gets there. So this is done by using a ratio. So once you get past the threshold where it actually turns the effect on, the ratio will say, okay, if it's a 5-to-1, for every 5 decibels in volume that signal would normally go up, you're only going to let it go up 1 decibel in volume. So you have all sorts of ratios. You have 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1, 7, 10, and usually like infinity. Infinity to 1 means it's a limiter. It won't let it get any louder at all. So that's basically what it's doing. It's just reducing the actual amplitude of that signal from that point forward. The biggest thing that people think a compressor is used for is to make the loud parts a little quieter, when in reality you want to make the quiet parts louder. So whatever your loudest point is, you want to bring the quiet points up so it kind of is in the same range. So you have what's called makeup gain. So once you get to the point where you've compressed it down, use your makeup gain to turn the low parts up to kind of come up to where the compressor threshold is. I'll show you a good example of that once we get into mixing this. So yeah, some terminology with the compressor. Threshold is how much volume you have to have before the compressor turns on. The attack, how fast you engage that compressor. Same thing with a gate. So you can either make it compress really fast or you can make it compress really slow. Hold, how long do you want to hold that compressor at that ratio before it drops below the threshold and starts to release. And the release, how quickly do we want to get back to just a straight unaffected signal, which is a 1-to-1 ratio. So the best way to use compressors is to be kind of artistic with it. You can mix an entire band without using any compression whatsoever. It is completely possible. It has been done for years. But if you want to get like a really nice punchy kick drum that has this real big nice hit, but you don't get a whole lot of like the reverberation or any of the other stuff that comes along with it, you can use a compressor and you can set a very slow attack. So you can let the initial kick come through at that huge spike in volume, but then once you get past that, what's called a transient, the initial hit of the kick drum, then you're going to compress everything after that. So you're going to get the big hit, but then it's going to be really quiet afterwards. The other thing is if you want to get something that's kind of got a ring to it, like a tom, you can compress the initial attack and make the release really quick. So you're just basically, the stick hit is all you're compressing, but the ring of the tom you're going to let go through the system like normal. So you can do different things to make those compressors work like that. Any question on compressors or gates? Because the next one we're going to talk about is effects, which is mostly reverb, and then we're ready to start playing around with the actual board. Anything? All right. So as far as effects goes, the two most common ones are delays and reverbs when it comes to mixing for a room. A reverb is kind of like a ringing effect, and a delay is an echo. That's basically what it's used for. In this room, the only things we use delays on are vocals, and we use them very sparingly, and only if we do it right. And by that I mean you don't want to delay the entire thing that the vocalist is saying. So you don't want to leave the delay on while they're singing the entire phrase that they're singing. Usually you want to turn on for the last word, so you just get the last word to echo. Or if they're like having this big, huge, long like belt part, maybe you want that to kind of continue on when they stop. So there's tricks of doing that, using mutes and different things. And you also don't want any reverb or effects on when they're talking to people in the congregation, because that just gets distracting. Makes it harder to hear them. Their voice kind of doesn't come through cleanly at all. So you want to mute effects whenever they're talking to people. Okay? Now what we do is something that's called side chaining. So what we do is we have a separate effects channel, and we send all the vocals to that channel that then gets sent to the reverb unit and come back into a separate return. And then we can turn that up and down as much as we want, and it doesn't affect the vocal channel any. We can turn the vocal channel down, and it turns it off in the effect. So that's the way side chaining works. You have a separate channel that's completely governed by the first channel, but so whenever this one goes up and down, this second channel goes with it. But if you turn this one up and down, it doesn't affect this one. So it's a completely separate channel, but it's being fed from the first one. So the other reason why we do that is because you can apply EQ to sidechain effects. You can apply compression, so you can make it sound really nice. So it's not like this big, huge. You're not creating a reverb on the entire frequency spectrum. You're just going to create a reverb on this one section, which is really good for vocals. But yeah, so that's the way you use sidechain effects. Again, that's the way we use effects on this board. Yeah. Questions? All right. I would highly encourage you, unless you're using a smaller band and you only have like less than 10 channels to worry about in total, I highly encourage you to use groups and DCAs. I use DCAs to get to things quickly. On a typical setup, our drums are not on the primary page. So with digital boards, you have pages of channels. This is actually a 32-channel mixer, but you only have 16 available to you at any one given point in time. Plus you have 16 channels of auxiliary inputs and effects inputs on another page, and then you have 16 bus master pages, but you only see 16 at any one point in time. So what I use DCAs to control groups of channels on pages that I don't see all the time. So a drum mix, so all my drums are on a separate channel. And also I do it for the entire band. So if the band sounds great, but they're a little too loud, I'm just going to bring the DCA down a little bit so I don't have to remix the entire band. So typical DCA assignments you may see is groups for vocals, groups for the band in general, the drum mixes, and anything that is not on the main page of channels. That's typically where you'll see a DCA. Groups kind of work the same way, except that, again, you can put effects on them and you can send them to multiple places. But it's the same concept, the same idea. Now, if you're on an analog board, and if you have everything going to the left-right bus or the main bus, and you have grouping going on, keep in mind that if you adjust the grouping, this is still going to the main left-right bus. So if you use groups, I would turn off the ability to send this to the main output fader. You want to control that volume from here. Okay? With digital, it works differently, but with this, it's either on or it's off. Okay? Last thing we're going to talk about, I think, is the idea of subwoofers. We have subwoofers here, and I have not isolated the signal to them, mostly because I didn't have enough time to actually tune the PA, but they've got a built-in crossover effect in them, so it should be okay for what we're going to do. But typically, you want to isolate what you send to a subwoofer. You don't want to send a vocal microphone to a subwoofer. It just doesn't work, trust me. Well, it does work, but it sounds really bad. And most of the time, you've EQ'd all that out of a microphone anyway, because you don't want any of those sub-lows coming through a vocal mic. So you can use EQs to do it. You can use a crossover effect, which basically says, okay, anything above this frequency we're going to send to the main amps for the main speakers. Anything below this frequency, we're going to send to the sub amps and the subwoofers. That's typically the way you see it done. Sometimes you'll say, okay, I only want to send certain channels to that, but I don't want to send all the channels at the same volume. So you may want to have your bass and your kick going to the high speakers, the main speakers, but at the same volume. But at the subwoofers, maybe you don't want quite as much bass in your subwoofers as you have your kick drum. But to do that, you have to use a separate mix and then adjust your bass down so that works that way. Most of the time, your subwoofers are located along the floors of your room. Most of the time. If you're in a room where the speakers are up in the ceiling, the main speakers, and the subwoofers are on the floor, you're supposed to use the time delay to make sure that the signal going to the subwoofers is timed accordingly, so that way whenever you're sitting in the room, the time it takes for the speaker from up top to get to you and the time from the subwoofers to get to you lines up and matches. That is well beyond the scope of what we're going to be doing today, but that is the way you're supposed to do it. I've seen a lot of people say that if you put subs on the floor, you can feel them and they feel great, but they don't necessarily sound great. So I've seen a lot of people, especially south, and they've been putting all their subs up in the ceiling with their main speakers, so they don't have to worry about time delays, and it sounds and feels more of a uniform experience. You don't get this huge rumble without the sound associated with it. Okay. Any questions on the principles for a basic mix?